Okay, we're going to be starting the mini module for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think those words that Danielle just shared is something that is a message that will be shared, like foundational throughout this whole presentation. So setting the stage with that, I think was just a beautiful way. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it's also known as the TRC. I have another photo here, which is often the commonly shown report. However, I just want to note there are so many different reports. There are 6 volumes that came out of the commission, and we'll be sharing some of those after. So we can't begin to talk about this work without first acknowledging those who made it happen. I want to take this moment to honor and acknowledge all the Indigenous people who shared their stories and their truths to make this report possible. So Danielle and her family attending the event in Vancouver and everyone who was able to. My grandma is a residential school survivor. She had 2 other siblings who also went to residential school. Her brother was sent to a different school than she was because they often split up the children. And she had a younger sister who also went. When my grandma was at residential school, she purposely failed a grade so she can be in the same grade as her sister so she could protect her. It was pretty clear from the beginning that family was always the most important thing in your life, and that never ended. To this day, her and her sister are extremely close. And it's really interesting to see, even though they went through all these really horrendous experiences, the strength they still have today. My grandma hasn't really spoken her language properly out loud to many people since she was a child. However, she still has that and is easily able to speak whenever we ask her to. She loves speaking it to us, but she really doesn't get to on a day-to-day basis. But that memory there for ancestors, for people, it's always within her. I do want to share a short little excerpt that the commissioner spoke about the word survivor. So a survivor is not someone who made it through the schools or just got by. A survivor is a person who persevered and overcame adversity. It refers to someone who has taken all that can be thrown at them and remained standing at the end. It came to mean someone who could legitimately say, I am still here. For that achievement, survivors deserve our highest respect. But for that achievement, we also owe them the debt of doing the right thing, and reconciliation is the right thing. Well, it's a difficult story that we're going to be going through today. It's also a story of courage and endurance, and the first step in any process of a national level reconciliation requires us all to attend to these voices, and those voices have been silenced for much too long. I want to start by sharing some words from intergenerational survivor Victoria Wells, and this quote was taken from one of the TRC testimony events. I'll know that reconciliation is happening in Canadian society when Canadians, wherever they live, are able to say the names of the tribes which they're neighbors. They're able to pronounce the names from the community or of people that they know, and they're able to say hello, goodbye in the language of their neighbors. That will show me manners. That will show me that they've invested in finding out the language of the land in which they live, because the language comes from the land. The language is very organic to where it comes from. And the invitation to you is to learn that and be enlightened by that and be informed by our ways of thinking, knowing, seeing, and understanding. So that to me is reconciliation. To start this mini module, I want to remind you of some concepts we touched on in the UNDRIP presentation. So recognizing that doctrines, policies, and practices are the basis of colonization in Canada and are what fueled the white supremacy views and policies we see today. So things like the doctrine of discovery, the idea of terra nullius, land belonging to nobody, the Royal Proclamation, and also the mistreatment of treaty rights. It's very essential that we understand the truths before we get into reconciliation. It's each of our responsibilities to commit to learning the truths and centering the survivors' voices in that learning. Here I have a quote by Chief Ian Campbell. Our history is your history. Until Canada accepts that, this society will never flourish to its full potential. To fully understand the truths requires settlers to hold this complexity of being angry or overwhelmed or maybe guilty, while simultaneously realizing that you may be directly benefiting from many of these truths. The image here on the screen is a zoomed in picture of one side of the bentwood box that was part of the TRC events. And this bentwood box was carved by a Coast Salish artist, Luke Marston. The bentwood box traveled with the TRC to all 8 of its national events throughout Canada, and people placed personal items in the box to symbolize a journey of healing and their own expressions of reconciliation. And it's kind of thought to be a lasting tribute to residential school survivors. I actually have another photo. I think it's the next one. Yeah. I wanted to share the full picture of it because it's such a beautiful carving and has many different sides to it. I just love its symbol. So now we're going to get into some more of the truths and background that led to the creation of the TRC. So cultural genocide speaks to the tactics and means employed to achieve genocide. Cultural is in no way less destructive than genocide. The concept of genocide itself was created within a colonial framework, and therefore interpretation and description of it can absolutely come into question. Indigenous cultures were targeted as the way to eradicate Indigenous people. The MMIWG National Inquiry is of the view that specific intent to destroy doesn't only cover physical or biological, but also covers the destruction of a group as a social unit. As Danielle touched on, in 1907, Peter Henderson Bryce put out a report that releasing evidence for rates of Indigenous children who were dying in residential schools. And one of the evidence he found was 24% of previously healthy Indigenous children were dying. As Danielle said, this evidence was not met kindly by the Canadian government. And as he continued to speak out as the whistleblower of residential schools, he eventually got forced out of public service for this. It's estimated that up to 94% of Indigenous population died due to disease brought over during colonization. I want to touch on a couple other tools that were used to support assimilation and genocide. So tools such as the Indian Act, the reserve system, residential schools, the 60 scoop, and even today we have the modern day scoop. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement is where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was born. So because of all these atrocities that occurred in residential schools and due to genocide and assimilation, many of these survivors took Canada to court. There was a large number of abuse claims filed by former students against the federal government, which created the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. This settlement was negotiated throughout 2006. And in 2007, it reached a consensus between the legal counsel for students, the churches, the Assembly of First Nation, multiple other Indigenous organizations were involved, and also the federal government. I do want to, again, take this time to recognize the work of survivors. Each survivor, the descendant of their survivors, had to outline their abuse and recount it numerous times. They often had their claims questioned for validity just to get this settlement alive. So there are 5 main outcomes of the settlement. The first being compensation for survivors. The second is the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we'll discuss today in detail. Number 3, there was also money set aside for commemoration activities and installations. There was money set aside for Indigenous specific health and healing services. And then there was also the creation of an independent assessment process. So for anyone who had claims of sexual abuse or serious physical abuse, they created an independent process that wasn't connected to the government to review those files. Okay, now we're going to get into the work of the TRC. the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the three commissioners were Justice Murray Sinclair, an Ojibwe judge, Marie Wilson, a CBC broadcaster from Yellowknife Northwest Territories, and Chief Wilton Littlechild, a Maskwacis lawyer. And I really, really want to raise my hands to these three for doing such amazing work with this commission. They led the charge and they did so many amazing community events, national events to get this off the ground. It was no small feat, and a lot of emotional labor went into this, having to hear these stories continuously for many years that's very heavy. So really just want to acknowledge them. So one of their main mandates was to unveil the experiences and the impacts of residential school in order to contribute to the healing. This began by applying pressure to government and church entities who held majority of the Indian residential school records and the documents. The TRC hosted 8 national events across the country, as well as over, I believe, about 70 community hearings, and this resulted in over 6,700 recorded survivor statements. And I also want to recognize that of those statements, this is only who were able to speak at those events. Many couldn't travel to those events. They just didn't have them in them to maybe share their stories. They weren't ready at that time, or maybe they were no longer living here on earth with us in order to share their stories. So part of the TRC work was also to create the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the NCTR, which is a permanent home for all statements and documents and any material that was collected by the TRC. UBC actually is the host of kind of a subset of that, like another branch. It's called the Indian Residential School Dialogue Center. So it's a branch to this. The main center here is in Manitoba, and then UBC hosts a branch where they have a lot of record keeping. The ceremonial release of all the reports happened in June of 2015. So the results from thousands of testimonies from residential school survivors within First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities accumulated to 6 volumes of reports. The commission compiled very detailed, comprehensive, and accurate reports on all the atrocities that occurred and were committed and had intergenerational effects to the system. A few reports that I want to point out. They're all really important to read and look through. The Principles of Truth and Reconciliation, Survivors Speak. It has some really great quotes and some details from survivors themselves. There are also some distinction-based reports. So there's the Métis experience, and then also the Inuit and Northern experience. So there was many significant findings the commission found during their comprehensive search, and I'm just going to provide a very brief overview of some of the findings. So at least 3,200 children died while in custody of the Indian residential school system, although Justice Murray Sinclair, the TRC chair, estimated the death rate is 10 times higher due to poor record keeping. And this is also seen through the recent discovery of many of the unmarked graves at the residential school site, that this number is probably very off. There was mistreatment of Indigenous people from colonization, and that is directly responsible for the negative stereotypes and stigmas associated with Indigenous people today. The Indian residential school system, along with other anti-Indigenous government policies, continue to have a direct impact on current policies today. And overall, it's very clear that Indigenous people are still suffering the consequences of colonization. So as you saw from the previous slide, this action-oriented report was only one of many, and it was created to recommend changes to programs and policies to address the legacy of residential schools and colonization. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report in 2015, it recommended 94 calls to action for the Canadian government and the people of Canada to right such horrifying wrongs. It's seen as a very important set of instructions that can help us on our path to reconciliation. However, I just want to take the time to amplify the importance of truly understanding the truths before we move on to these calls to action. That's why it's called Truth Before Reconciliation. So I highly recommend you going and reading some of the other reports first before feeling like you can dive deep into these actions and really understanding those truths. So this was a very significant moment having these actions, because it's often seen as the country's preliminary attempts to begin dismantling the systemic anti-Indigenous racism that's brought through the system and country. Oh yeah, Danielle, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Jordan, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I was just watching a friend of mine's TEDx, Kevin Lamoureux from Manitoba, and I thought he put forward this really excellent question for people to get in the habit of linking the truth to the calls to action. So he was encouraging people to always ask themselves, why is this being asked of us? Of any of the particular calls to action, because then you will have to go back and understand the truth that underpins that particular call. So I just wanted to share that this morning.
That's such a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. I really like that idea. I don't think that's something I've actually sat down and done. I think it's in the back of my mind, but I really, really like that idea. We're just gonna go over a couple of the calls to action. I just pulled out a few. There's many, many more health related ones. There's many more that will likely relate to your job and your sphere of influence. But there's just a couple here that I highlighted. So call 19 is to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. Call 22, we call upon those who can affect change with the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices. And call 57, very timely, we call upon provincial governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal people, including the history and legacy of residential schools, UNDRIP, treaties, Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. So this is why we're all here today. Okay, this is a busy slide, but I will break it down, don't worry. So looking at first this wording here, the federal government is directly or jointly accountable for 76 of the 94 calls to action. Actually, on their website, they provide a very detailed explanation of the actions that they have been working on. And this is a screenshot of that site. So I just pulled action 23, and then underneath there's a little button that you can click on what's happening, and it provides detailed explanation with evidence. It goes much longer than this of everything they've done to work on action 23. So the federal government claims that they've completed 17 of the calls to action. However, external Indigenous organizations have been very closely following and reviewing materials to determine whether those 17 have actually been complete. So there's a site called Indigenous Watchdog. It's a federally registered nonprofit, and they collect information from many different sources, from government stakeholders, media, research reports, studies, stats and budgets like that. And they claim, as well as the Yellowhead Institute, that there's been 11, oh no, I tried to get a photo in front, but it went behind. That's okay. And they've claimed there's only been 11 complete. So it's really important to recognize that Indigenous people are the ones who get to decide whether the call is complete. And this site, Indigenous Watchdog, that I wish you could see the screenshot, but I didn't put the picture there properly. It provides a really great overview showing the comparison between a bunch of external organizations. So, because there's a lot of different sites following the calls to action very closely. So CBC, it's called Beyond 94. They've been following the calls to action to see which have been complete. The Yellowhead Institution, which is this photo on the right-hand side, obviously the federal government and Indigenous Watchdog. So on the Watchdog site, they lay it out on a table and provide all the evidence that these external organizations have shown for whether they believe this call is complete or not. So the general consensus from external organizations is there's about 11 to 12 complete. And there is definitely discrepancies in the understanding of what it means to complete a call or what the call itself means. Okay, I'm going to try to share a video. Everyone cross their fingers that it works. It worked well last time. Uh-oh.
So what is reconciliation anyway? There's a number of things that are not reconciliation. Hiring more Indigenous peoples is not reconciliation. Having more artwork in offices is not reconciliation. We should already be doing these things.
Before how I can help comes as a question, I think they first need to understand.
All you need is access to Google, and you'll be able to get onto the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and read the report. And even if you don't want to read it, you can read it in YouTube videos, have it read to you.
And then not just know the truth, but there's the justice part where you actually address and make amends for everything that's happened and is still happening.
The reality is that First Nations kids are still getting between 20 to 50% less funding across every public service.
So until there's no more murdered and missing Indigenous women or are people over incarcerated in prison, how can we skip forward to the fun reconciliation part of things?
There is no federal plan to eliminate those inequalities. And some people say, well, you know, there must be a reason for this. But let's take boil water advisories. The government of Canada can get a DART team in the air, fly them to an earthquake zone halfway around the world to get clean water pumping in 24 hours. So why can't they do that for First Nations communities in Canada? We're making choices to allow the racial discrimination to continue. And that's what we need to stop.
We will never get to real truth, justice, and reconciliation until there is a substantial transfer of power, wealth, and resources. And that means lands have to come back. That also means there has to be us sharing in the resources. And it also means a recognition and full implementation of our sovereign right to be self-determining.
When you think about the greatest human rights abuses that were done in Canada, the Chinese head tax, the internment of Japanese Canadians, and residential school, they all have two things in common. First, they were all perpetrated by the Canadian government. And second, we all let it happen because we couldn't watch the injustice and speak up and do something about it. Reconciliation is our chance to learn how to not turn away.
If I help these people in professional positions or positions of power understand what it is Indigenous people have been going through and have gone through, it's going to help my children in school right now. It's going to help their children, and it's going to help, 7 generations.
That's why I never talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation. You won't get that from hanging artwork in an office.
Help TVO create a better world through the power.
I really liked that video. I think it really showed the message that I've been trying to share of understanding the truths. And I'm so excited to now implement Danielle's tip into looking into all the calls of action. So we're going to briefly go.
Jordan, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I was like trying so hard to find a picture because my dad was carrying Lucy on his shoulders in this march across the bridge at the TRC event. And I couldn't find it. I didn't have it on my phone. So I'm so happy to see that. And just so everybody knows, Lucy and I and my dad were all there.
I was like
somewhere
one,
in
though.
there.
I was like
Yeah,
one.
1.5.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you to Kate for finding this photo and adding it. That was her doing. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Danielle. So we do want to bring it back to our own BC responsibility and our perspective here. So it's important to recognize that BC hosted one of the national TRC events in Vancouver. So survivors from these lands shared their truths here. The current BC government has committed to the TRC in 2017. And from that, the BC government introduced the draft principles that guide the province of British Columbia's relationship with Indigenous people to really help guide that work of implementing the calls to action. All of the provincial ministers have been tasked with finding ways to implement the calls to action in BC. And we provided a specific quote from the Minister of Health's mandate letter. All Crown agencies are expected to incorporate the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission within their specific mandate and context. I'm going to hand it over to Kate. She's going to say a few more words and then take it from there.
Thanks so much, Jordan. And thanks to Danielle for sharing like that you were here on this bridge during the walk for reconciliation during the national TRC event that was held in Vancouver at the PNE on the 2013. And I think about that basket and that copper pot and sort of how those two baskets of work come together or came together there. With you and your family sharing your experiences in the residential schools so that settlers like me, I attended the event, could listen and witness and hear those truths. And then I think about what Pom Palmater was just saying about truth, justice, and reconciliation. And that's a responsibility that I carry with me now, having heard those testimonies. And the one that stood out to me so strongly. So I came to the TRC event understanding that the sexual and physical abuse that took place at residential schools were horrific abuses. But one elder who was there talked about the experience of being taken from a loving family. And that was the abuse that he experienced. And that was an aha moment when I realized the policy was an abuse before even people got to the schools, that kidnapping from families, loving families that took place. And I just wanted to sort of acknowledge the responsibility that comes with that, and also recognize this word Namwayut was provided by Chief Robert Joseph, not Bob Joseph, who wrote the 21 Things, but his dad, who's a reconciliation ambassador here from Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And this is a Kwakwala word that means we are all one. And it was offered by him as one of the theme words. It's like one of the values of Reconciliation Canada. So I just wanted to share that here. Thank you.